Visitor, it was the middle of January in northern Minnesota, and the winter that year had been especially brutal. The temperature had dropped far below freezing, and a heavy snowstorm had been raging since the afternoon. I lived alone in a small wooden house on the edge of a quiet rural town surrounded by thick pine forests. Nights were usually peaceful there, but during snowstorms everything felt even more isolated. The wind would howl through the trees, and the snow piled up so fast that sometimes it buried half the windows. That night I had just gotten home from my late shift at the grocery store around 9:30 p.m. My boots were covered in snow and my fingers were numb even through my gloves. I locked the front door, turned up the heat, and made myself a bowl of hot soup before settling onto the couch with a blanket. Outside, the wind slammed snow against the walls of the house like waves hitting a boat. It was the kind of night where no sane person would be outside. After about an hour of watching television, I must have fallen asleep. I woke up suddenly sometime later, confused and disoriented. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. The house was completely dark except for the faint blue light of the TV screen. Then I heard it again. 3 soft knocks on the front door. They were quiet but clear enough that I knew I hadn't imagined them. My heart started beating faster as I sat up on the couch. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 1:17 a.m. The storm outside was still raging, and the idea that someone could be standing out there in that weather didn't make much sense. I slowly walked toward the front door and looked through the peephole. At first, I couldn't see anything except swirling snow. I stood there for a few seconds, waiting for someone to knock again, but the night stayed silent. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked the door and opened it just a few inches. The wind immediately pushed snow into the hallway. I stepped out onto the porch and looked around. There was no one there. The road in front of my house was barely visible through the whiteout conditions. However, when I looked down at the snow covering the porch steps, I noticed something strange. There were deep tracks leading up to the door. The snow was so thick that the tracks didn't look like normal footprints. Instead, it looked as if someone had been dragging their feet slowly through the snow all the way to my porch. What bothered me even more was that I couldn't see any tracks leading away. I stood there for a moment staring into the storm, feeling that uncomfortable sensation of being watched. The wind howled through the trees behind the house, and the darkness beyond the porch felt endless. Eventually, I stepped back inside and locked the door quickly. I tried to convince myself that maybe the snow had already covered the tracks leading away. Still, something about it didn't feel right. I turned off the TV and decided to go upstairs to bed. The house was quiet except for the storm outside. It took me a while to fall asleep, but eventually exhaustion won. A couple of hours later, I woke up again, shivering violently. At first, I thought the blanket had fallen off the bed, but when I sat up, I realized the entire room was freezing. I could see my breath in the air. Confused, I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. It was only 3:02 a.m. I got out of bed and stepped into the hallway. The cold was even worse there. It felt like the heat had completely stopped working. I hurried downstairs to check the thermostat on the wall near the living room. When I reached it, I immediately noticed something strange. The thermostat had been switched to OFF. I was certain I had never touched it. For a moment, I just stood there staring at the dial, trying to make sense of it. Then I noticed something else. The back door at the end of the kitchen hallway was slightly open. A thin line of snow had blown inside across the floor. My stomach dropped. I slowly walked toward the kitchen, every step feeling heavier than the last. The house was so quiet that I could hear the wind whistling through the small gap in the door. Just as I reached the corner that led into the living room, I heard a sound, the soft creak of the rocking chair near the fireplace. I froze. That chair only made that sound when someone sat in it. For several seconds I couldn't move. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it was echoing in my ears. Slowly, I leaned forward just enough to look around the corner into the living room. The rocking chair was moving gently back and forth, and someone was sitting in it. It was a tall man wearing a dark coat covered in snow. His head was tilted slightly to one side, and he was staring straight at me from across the room. Even in the dim light I could see his pale face and the faint smile stretching across it. He didn't blink, he didn't move, he just watched me. The moment our eyes met, the chair stopped rocking. For a second neither of us said anything. Then the man slowly lifted one hand and knocked 3 times on the wooden arm of the chair, the same 3 knocks I had heard earlier. That was when I turned and ran upstairs. Story 2. The last bus stop. It was late December in a small town in northern Michigan, the kind of place where winter seemed to last forever. Snow covered everything for miles, from the rooftops to the empty roads that stretched through thick forests. By early evening the temperature had already dropped well below freezing, and the wind coming off the frozen lake made it feel even colder. I worked the closing shift at a small convenience store on the edge of town, and that night had been unusually quiet. Most people stayed home when the weather got that bad. Around 10:45 p.m. I finally locked the store, finished counting the register, and stepped outside. The snow had been falling steadily all evening, and by then several inches had already piled up on the ground. Normally I drove home, but that night my car refused to start. The battery had died from the cold. After trying for 15 minutes and getting nowhere, I gave up and decided to take the last bus that ran through town. The bus stop was about a 5-minute walk from the store, right near the entrance to a long road that led out toward the highway. There weren't many buildings around there, just a few closed shops, an empty parking lot, and a single streetlight that flickered every now and then. By the time I reached the bus stop, the snow was coming down harder. The wind blew flakes across the road like waves of white dust. I pulled my coat tighter and checked my phone. The last bus was supposed to arrive in about 8 minutes. I stood under the small metal shelter, trying to stay out of the wind. For a while the only sound was the wind pushing snow along the road. The town looked completely deserted. No cars passed, no lights appeared in the distance. It felt like I was the only person left awake in the entire place. Then I heard footsteps. At first I thought it was just the crunch of snow shifting in the wind. But after a moment I heard it again, slow, heavy steps coming from somewhere down the road behind the bus stop. I turned and looked through the snowy darkness. At first I didn't see anything. Then about 20 feet away, I noticed a figure standing near the edge of the parking lot. He was just standing there. The man was tall and dressed in a dark winter coat with the hood pulled up. Snow clung to his shoulders and sleeves like he had been standing outside for a long time. I couldn't see his face clearly because of the darkness, but I could tell he was looking directly at me. I nodded slightly, the way people sometimes acknowledge strangers without really starting a conversation. But the man didn't move or respond. He just continued standing there, staring. Something about the way he stood felt wrong. Most people waiting for a bus would at least come stand under the shelter to get out of the wind. But he stayed out in the open snow, completely still. After a minute I looked away and checked my phone again. 5 minutes until the bus arrived. When I looked back up, the man was closer. I hadn't heard him walk over. Now he stood only about 10 feet away from the shelter. His boots were half buried in the snow, and his head was slightly tilted as if he were studying me. "You waiting for the bus too?" I asked, mostly just to break the uncomfortable silence. He didn't answer. For several seconds he just stood there. Then he slowly stepped forward and entered the shelter with me. The sudden closeness made the space feel much smaller. I could smell the cold air on his clothes, mixed with something metallic, like wet iron. His hood was still pulled low over his face, hiding his eyes in shadow. I shifted slightly, pretending to look down the road for the bus. That was when I noticed something strange. There were no footprints behind him in the snow. The ground where he had supposedly walked was completely smooth except for the wind patterns. I felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the temperature. Before I could think about it too much. The man spoke. His voice was quiet and flat. "Did you hear it?" I looked at him, confused. "Hear what?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward the dark forest across the road. "The footsteps," he said softly. "They follow people out here." I stared at him, unsure if he was joking or just strange. "I think that was you walking earlier." The man shook his head slowly. "I've been standing here for 20 minutes. The wind outside suddenly picked up, rattling the metal roof of the shelter. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I heard it again, footsteps, crunching slowly through the snow somewhere behind the bus stop. My stomach tightened. I turned around quickly, scanning the dark parking lot and the road leading back toward town. There was no one there, but the footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming. Closer. Crunch. 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 Each step sounded heavy, like someone walking through deep snow. The sound moved slowly around the side of the shelter, circling us. I looked back at the man standing beside me. His head was lowered now, and he seemed to be listening carefully. "You hear it now," he whispered. The footsteps stopped just outside the shelter. For a few seconds everything was silent again. Then the streetlight above us flickered. The light blinked off for a split second, and in that darkness I heard breathing. Not mine, not the man beside me, but something else standing just outside the shelter. The light flickered back on. The snow around the bus stop was completely empty, but a new set of footprints had appeared in the snow directly in front of the shelter entrance, fresh ones, and they were still forming. One by one, as if someone invisible was walking toward us. I slowly turned toward the man beside me, but the shelter was suddenly empty. He was gone. Only his footprints remained in the snow beside mine, and the invisible footsteps were still getting closer. Story 3. The snowed-in cabin. It happened in February a few years ago when I took a short winter trip to Colorado. I had rented a small wooden cabin deep in the mountains, about 20 miles away from the nearest town. The place looked amazing in the photos online, just a quiet little cabin surrounded by tall pine trees and endless snow. I wanted a few days away from everything, somewhere peaceful where I could relax and enjoy the winter scenery. When I arrived in the afternoon, the sky was already gray and heavy with clouds. The owner had warned me that snowstorms could roll in quickly up there, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The cabin itself was simple but cozy. It had a small living room with a fireplace, a kitchen, and a bedroom upstairs under the slanted roof. The forest around it was completely silent except for the occasional wind moving through the trees. By early evening, the snowstorm had already started. At first it was light, but within an hour thick snowflakes were falling so heavily that I could barely see past the porch. The wind picked up and began pushing snow against the windows. I locked the door, turned on the heater, and started a fire in the fireplace. Inside the cabin everything felt warm and comfortable compared to the freezing darkness outside. I made some coffee, sat down on the couch, and watched the storm through the window. It felt like being inside a snow globe. Around 9:30 p.m. I decided to go upstairs and get some sleep. The storm outside had become so loud that it almost sounded like waves crashing against the walls of the cabin. Still, I eventually drifted off. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep when something woke me up. At first, I thought it was just the wind shaking the cabin. But then I heard it again, knocking, very slow. Quiet knocking, 3 knocks. They sounded like they were coming from downstairs. I sat up in bed, listening carefully. The entire cabin was dark except for a faint glow from the dying fire downstairs. For a few seconds I didn't hear anything else. Then the knocking came again. 3 slow knocks. My first thought was that maybe a branch from a tree was hitting the side of the cabin because of the wind. But something about the rhythm of the knocks felt too deliberate. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 1:12. No one should have been out there in the middle of a snowstorm like that, especially not miles away from town. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I slowly walked down the wooden stairs, each step creaking softly under my weight. The living room was dim, lit only by the last few glowing embers in the fireplace. The front door stood at the far end of the room. Just as I reached the bottom of the stairs, the knocking happened again. This time it was louder. 3 knocks. I walked toward the door and looked through the small glass window beside it. Snow swirled across the porch, but I couldn't see anyone standing there. The wind was so strong it made the trees bend and sway in the darkness. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and opening it slightly. The freezing wind immediately rushed inside. I stepped out onto the porch and looked around. There was no one there, but when I looked down at the snow covering the wooden steps, I felt my stomach drop. There were footprints, large, deep footprints leading up to the porch, but just like in the earlier stories you told me, there were no footprints leading away. The tracks stopped right in front of the door. I stood there for several seconds staring into the storm, trying to see if someone was walking away into the trees, but the snowfall was too heavy. Visibility was only a few feet. Eventually I stepped back inside and locked the door tightly. Something about the situation made my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had come to the wrong cabin and then quickly left. But the missing footprints didn't make sense. I checked all the windows and made sure everything was locked. After that I went back upstairs. Though I doubted I would fall asleep again, I had just laid back down when I heard a sound from below. A soft creaking noise, like someone slowly walking across the wooden floor of the living room. My heart started pounding. I sat up again and listened. Creak. Another step. There was no way that sound was coming from outside. Someone was inside the cabin. I grabbed my phone and quietly moved to the top of the stairs. The living room below was almost completely dark now since the fire had died out, but I could still see the outline of the front door. And something else. A tall figure standing in the middle of the room. The man was completely still, facing the staircase. Even in the darkness I could see that his clothes were covered in snow. He must have been standing there for a while because the snow on his shoulders had begun melting and dripping onto the wooden floor. For a moment neither of us moved. Then the man slowly lifted his head. I could barely make out his face, but I saw the same expression that haunted me for months afterward, a small, quiet smile. He took one slow step toward the stairs. The wooden floor creaked again. That was when I ran back into the bedroom and locked the door. My hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 tries to dial 911. I whispered to the operator that someone had broken into the cabin. While I was on the phone, I could hear footsteps moving slowly up the staircase outside the bedroom. Each step creaked louder than the last. Then the footsteps stopped right outside my door. There was a long silence, and then 3 slow knocks, exactly the same as before. The man didn't try to break the door down. He just stood there silently on the other side. After about 20 seconds, I heard the footsteps walk away again. Going back down the stairs, the police arrived about 15 minutes later, after fighting their way through the storm. When they searched the cabin, the man was gone. The front door was still locked from the inside, and the only footprints outside were the ones leading up to the porch. None leading away. Even now, I still don't understand how someone could appear out of a blizzard, enter a locked cabin, and then disappear again without leaving a single track in the snow. But sometimes when I think about that night, one thing bothers me more than anything else, those 3 knocks, because months later, when I was back home in another state, I woke up one night to the exact same sound. 3 slow knocks on my front door.